So my guests here today are Ambassador Alan Baker. He's the director of the Institute for Contemporary Affairs at the Jerusalem Center and the head of the Global Law Forum. He participated in the negotiations and drafting of the Oslo Accords with the Palestinians, as well as agreements and peace treaties with Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. He served as legal advisor and deputy director general of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and as Israel's ambassador to Canada. I'm also joined by Bob Meyer. He's an American lawyer and businessman and an expert on the sources of the right of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. I want to thank you both for joining me today. And today we're going to be talking about two new publishings by the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs, Israel Under Fire. The first volume is The International Legal and Diplomatic Battlefield. The second is Ideological, Psychological, and Economic Warfare. Bob, you wrote the first chapter on the attempts to deny the right of the Jewish people to Israel. Tell me a little bit about your expertise in that field, but also why you decided to write this book. Why was it so important to write this book right now?
I was approached by Dan Diker to make the case about the Mandate for Palestine, which is a very little known international agreement that establishes the right of the Jewish people to the land of Israel by recognizing the historical connection of the Jewish people and recognizing the national and political rights of the Jewish people only to the land of Israel. The Mandate for Palestine agreement was enacted unanimously by the League of Nations on July 24th, 1922, and it's the culmination of three steps. The Balfour Declaration, which was a declaration by Great Britain, November 2nd, 1917. The San Remo Resolution, which is a resolution by the League of Nations, which incorporated verbatim the Balfour Declaration, and then the international instrument known as the Mandate for Palestine. I call it the Mandate for Palestine Agreement. And it recognized, this was after World War I, where the League of Nations had to deal with the decolonization of Turkish possessions outside of Turkey. And they created three so-called Class A mandates. Why were they Class A? These were territories that were deemed to be very close to having national nationhood or sovereignty, statehood. They were Syria, Lebanon, Mesopotamia or Iraq, and Palestine. And in identifying the rightful people to be the owners of Palestine, there was cases made before the League of Nations by Arabs, and there were cases made by the Jews, and they established the Jews. It's an 11-page document which has 14 references to Jew, Jewish, and Zionist. And it was established as a treaty. The United States signed onto it, even though it was not a member of the League of Nations, 2 years later in its treaty with Great Britain, which was the trustee or mandatory of the territory. And it was incorporated by general reference in Article 80, the so-called Palestine Article of the United Nations Charter of 1946. It's a very strong international agreement. And it's a pity we don't assert it more, because against it are a whole host of non-binding UN General Assembly resolutions, not to mention a flood of lies. The resolutions have no legal standing. They're suggestions. They're statements of opinion. A resolution is only binding if it's adopted by two or more nations and is a bilateral or multilateral agreement.
And so tell me, how do you respond to this rhetoric to delegitimize the Jewish people's connection to Israel when there's such strong legal and, of course, historical foundations?
I cite the Mandate for Palestine, but my goal is to have others use it. It's a very powerful tool. It's in Hebrew we say it's a totach, it's a cannon that we don't shoot, and we should. For example, on November 29th, 1947, when the UN partition resolution was passed, we all have seen those movies of Jews in Tel Aviv and other parts of Israel dancing the hora in the streets. That was a non-binding resolution. And because, although we accepted it, which we actually should have stood on our prior rights under the mandate. The Arabs didn't in any event, and so it stands for nothing. Legally, I'm talking about legally, it stands for nothing. And this doesn't even get into the the biblical origins. This is all under international law. And I just think it's an important agreement to be asserted in favor of us. In the UN, there's this relatively new term, OPT, Occupied Palestinian Territories. Ain't no such thing. It doesn't exist. And the fact that the whole world is on this kick doesn't make it right.
Ambassador, I want to fast forward now. We were discussing about the foundations of Israel when it comes to the legal sense, but I want to talk about the legal and diplomatic battlefield Israel has been facing in this past year, particularly these claims by the ICC and the ICJ. Tell me a little bit about the difficulty, and in your eyes, your assessment of how Israel has handled that battlefield.
Well, look, when we think about the call that's reverberating in all these huge demonstrations on US campuses and on the streets of Britain and Canada and various other places, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. This basically is a statement saying that what Bob Mayer has written and the foundational documents that exist and are international treaties and are binding, that they mean nothing, and therefore they should be cancelled. And this is the basic underlying factor in the campaign of delegitimizing Israel, and it's part and parcel of this concept of Israel under fire. Part of Israel being under fire, which is the title of these two books, is the fact that Israel's not just under fire from rockets and terrorists. Israel is under fire by those who are trying to completely undermine its very existence and legitimacy. And so this is why it's very important. Now, unfortunately, the international community doesn't base itself on pure legal documentation. The international community acts in accordance with its own economic interests, political interests, and this we're seeing every day, whether it's the events behind the elections in the United States, or what's going on in the Ukraine, between the Ukraine and Russia or China. Law, regrettably, doesn't play a very large part in all this, and the actions of the Security Council and the actions of the international courts aren't genuinely based on law. As Bob said, the resolutions of the General Assembly are simply an indicative of the political position of the majority of states that voted for them. They've got absolutely no legal binding nature, and they can't oblige any state to do anything. They're just saying, well, we're the majority and this is what we believe. If the majority of states were to say that Alan Baker has a head full of hair, then that, according to the United Nations, would be fact and acceptable. This, unfortunately, is the trend in today's international politics. And this also permeates into the international justice system, because the international justice system is composed basically of two tribunals. A UN court, which is the International Court of Justice at The Hague, which is a UN body like the Security Council or the General Assembly, and it's composed of 15 judges who are elected by their countries and who basically receive instructions from their countries, and who sit on whether it's litigation between states or requests for advisory opinions from the UN. But their judgments or their political or their legal opinions are based on political viewpoints. Similarly with the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is a court that was, strangely enough, established principally by Jewish international lawyers, Jewish and Israeli international lawyers, after the Holocaust, in order to provide an answer for the most terrible crimes that were committed by individuals, so that it would be possible to bring individuals to trial for the most serious crimes against humanity, which didn't exist up to then. There were individual tribunals in Rwanda and Sierra Leone and various other places, and Yugoslavia, but there wasn't a universal form of international justice. Unfortunately, this International Criminal Court, despite the very noble ideas and principles behind it, because it's composed of states, because it's composed of judges who are elected by states, because it's composed of a prosecutor who is subject to instructions also, ultimately doesn't produce international justice, but echoes the international situation as dictated by the United Nations. So in principle, as much as we would like to be guided by purely legal foundational documentation, which in our opinion would be very clear and would give us the very basic rights that Israel is entitled to, that have been recognized, unfortunately the world is guided by politics, it's guided by interests, it's guided by elections in this or that country, and it's guided by leaders who and international media who have their own opinion and develop their own opinion based on a lot of false or misleading information, and this places us in a situation that we're facing today when we say Israel is under fire, because Israel is under fire in the UN, Israel is under fire in the territories, Israel is under fire from Yemen, Israel is under fire from Lebanon, Israel is under fire economically, and Israel is under fire by all the non-governmental organizations who are very influential and place a lot of pressure on governments, and Israel is under fire psychologically, because the Israeli population is living in this pressure cooker that's simply impossible. It's very difficult to act normally and be able to conduct a normal day-to-day life when you live in this situation.
It's a phenomenon that's only unique to Israel. I mean, this concept of being attacked by a terror organization and somehow Israel is blamed for it, but not only that, Israel's entire existence were beyond 70 years, and yet it still comes into question. This book, I think, really shows that fire goes way beyond the conventional battlefield. But my question is to what extent is Israel returning the fire and shooting appropriately?
Okay, it's a difficult question because when Israel shoots, for instance, in the Gaza Strip, and when the BBC and Sky News and ITV and CNN and various other organizations show devastation in Gaza, they don't say, well, the reason that all these houses were devastated is because there were weapons storage facilities, or people were firing from them, and therefore they became legitimate military targets.
And when I say shoot, I mean in a metaphorical sense, in terms of when we're talking about the legal battlefield. Mm-hmm. How is Israel responding to these legal cases that are mounting up against it, to the fact that they're consistently being denied its own right to exist? Do you think that the Israeli government is responding appropriately, that we're doing the right thing?
I think they should respond using this Mandate for Palestine agreement. It's a very strong statement. There's no rule in international law that I know of that says just because an agreement was agreed to more than 100 years ago, it somehow is faded into history and it doesn't apply. I mean, of course, there's certain, the state of Israel's been declared, it's been accepted into the United Nations in 1949, but the principles still stand. The international community got together after the mess of World War I, and in the case of Palestine, or Eretz Yisrael, said, this is the Jews' place. And it was sui generis, as Alan has noted in the past, because it also said it's not this ruling, this agreement and recognition of Jewish national and political rights here was not just for the yeshuv, the settlement that was there at the time of a few 100,000 Jews. It was for all 12 million Jews in the world at the time. And further to what you just mentioned, there were 15 mandates of the League of Nations. The only one of the 15 that is still challenged today is the one relating to us. I mean, you have to look under the hood a little bit and say there could be some anti-Semitism here. So I think we should come out swinging, and I think it's a very strong argument. And people will say, oh, that was a long time ago, it's different. The Arabs, I already put in my piece, the Muslim community will not recognize it in any event, to the extent they're driven by the Quran, because the Quran says in Surah 2, verse 191, drive them out from where they drove you out. That's been interpreted to mean over the past 1,400 years by Muslim clerics that once land becomes Muslim by conquest or any other means, it remains Muslim forever. The land of Israel was conquered by Caliph Umar in 736, 737 CE, 5 years after the death of Muhammad. And as from an Islamic point of view, it's Muslim forever. It's actually been ruled by Muslims except for the 188-year Crusader period, and then starting with the British occupation of the area by General Allenby at the end of towards the end of World War I. But from their point of view, it's Muslim forever, which is why they say from the river to the sea, and why Yasser Arafat and Abu Mazen, in their two respective negotiations, could not compromise. They wanted 100%. That's their position.
And the second volume addresses the ideological, psychological, and the economic warfare that you addressed earlier, Alan. But I wanted to ask you, what prompted you to write specifically about the ideological warfare?
Because the use of psychological warfare with the modern day means of communication and social the social channels of communication has become so enhanced that perhaps what's going on today in this war, more than any other time, is having its effect on the population. And whether it's Hamas or whether it's Hezbollah or Iran or any of the others, they're using this. They're using this to influence the populations. They're using this to influence the U.S. electorate. The Russians are using it. So it's become a very important element, and therefore we felt that it was very important both to discuss that, but also to discuss the psychological effects on Israelis, the average Israeli in the street. People come here, tourists come here, and they're surprised by, goodness me, we're hearing that there are planes going over, and we're hearing in the distance booms, and you people are just walking around and sitting in cafes, and life goes on. It's a very strange psychological ambiance that I felt needs to be discussed within the context of this series of articles on Israel under fire.
And Ambassador, before I let you both go, I want to quickly ask you, having participated in the Oslo Accords, first of all, what have been the lessons learned from 30 years since then almost? And are you still optimistic that we'll get some type of peace in the region?
Look, I've always been optimistic, otherwise I wouldn't have been able to take part in these negotiations. I've negotiated personally with all the various people, whether it's Arafat or Mahmoud Abbas or the big terrorists like Jibril Rajoub, Mohammed Dakhlan, who are presently competing to take over from Mahmoud Abbas. And we established very cordial relationships during the course of the negotiations, and it was basically a question of, we understand each other, and therefore if we ever have any problems, we can always solve these problems by lifting the phone and having a chat about it. And this was their hope. The problem was the growing influence of fanatical Muslim, fanatical Islam on those who the world considers to be moderate. And in actual fact, as Bob said, the concept of Islam is that there's no room for anybody else. Whether you're Jew, Christian, or whatever, you're an infidel, basically. You've got no right to be here. And this is what overtook any concept of moderation, of trying to live together in bon voisinage between the Israeli peoples and the Egyptian peoples, the Palestinian peoples, the Lebanese peoples, which is possible. But this overtook pragmatic possibilities and has permeated into the whole concept of the Islamic way of looking at Israel and the West, by the way. It's not just Israel. And so my optimism as to whether we can reach some type of practical, pragmatic, realistic solution and live together has been slightly tarred by this development of Islamistic fanaticism into most of the Arab regimes that we're dealing with. So it's very difficult for me to say that I'm optimistic that we'll ever reach something. I'd like to think so, because I can remember on the day that we signed the interim agreement with Yasser Arafat, Yasser Arafat went from one to another across the table, kissing everybody. And we were genuinely happy that, okay, we've made a huge step forward towards peace between peoples. A month later, buses started to explode, and we realized that we were somewhat naive. But this is the situation, so it's very difficult to be able to bring the two elements together, the strict Muslim viewpoint as to anybody, and the practical possibility of reaching some type of compromise. And so whether anything can be based on foundational documents or not, today has to face the dogmatic issues of fanatical Islam, and it's going to be very difficult to find a way of reaching the two.
Ambassador Alan Baker and Bob Meyer, thank you both for joining me today to discuss this new book, Israel Under Fire. It's certainly the textbook that many need to read to understand properly the situation here and the legal basis that Israel does have a right to this land. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.